The Black Briar House. By the time the rain began, Wicklow had already withdrawn into itself, as if it sensed something standing at the far end. Lamps were lit early, doors closed softly. Footsteps along the stone lanes sounded muted. Even the church bell carried differently in that season. Its toll thickened by fog, its sound duller than it ought to be. There were evenings when Wicklow felt submerged. The sky pressed low and black. Smoke from chimneys drifted only a few feet before dissolving, as though swallowed by unseen depths. And at the far end of the narrowest lane, where the cottages thinned and the hedges rose high and untrimmed, stood a house that did not sync with the rest of the town. The Black Briar House had not always been black. Time and rain had done that. The stone was once pale, the trim once painted white. But years of neglect, weather, and something less easily named had darkened it. Even at dusk, when Wicklow glowed amber in dying daylight, the house remained a silhouette. It stood behind a crooked iron gate and a tangle of thorn that no gardener had dared cut back in decades. The briar climbed the fence, crawled along the porch beams, and knotted itself around the lower windows. In rain, the thorns shone like wet bones. On certain nights, a single window on the upper floor appeared faintly lit. No one in Wicklow admitted to seeing it, but no one denied it either. The legend was older than the house. Before stone walls and high gables rose upon that ground, there had been a small timber dwelling belonging to a widow. She had lived alone, surviving on herbs, roots, and whatever coin the town would spare for remedies. When illness came through Wicklow, as illness always does, grief demanded someone to blame. The widow knew too much. She spoke too little. She did not weep loudly enough when children died. They accused her of witchcraft. They hanged her beneath a late autumn moon. They buried her where the briar grows thickest. Over generations, stories accumulated like dust in unused rooms. Doors slamming where no wind moved. Lights seen at night. Voices heard in the hedges. A young laborer who dared enter on a drunken wager and was found days later wandering the road barefoot, his eyes vacant and his speech reduced to one repeated word before he vanished entirely. Taken. The house became a boundary. Children were warned away from Briar End before they were old enough to question why. Strangers were told the lane led nowhere. Wicklow learned the shape of its fear and built its life around it. But youth is often drawn to the shape of danger. Margot first heard of the Black Briar House in a half-forgotten column of local folklore printed between advertisements for antique fairs and harvest festivals. She did not believe in curses. She believed in proof. She believed that fear was an old garment best turned inside out and examined under bright light. Ron believed in Margot. Peter believed in his equipment. They arrived in Wicklow under a sky the color of bruised steel. The hedgerows were wet. The air smelled faintly metallic, like rain that had not yet fallen. They walked Briar End with the careless confidence of those who have not yet encountered consequence. A woman drawing curtains in one of the last cottages paused when she saw them. "You'll not get what you're hoping for," she called softly. Margot smiled. "Oh, we're not hoping for anything." "That's worse," the woman replied and shut her door. They continued. The iron gate resisted slightly, as though it had grown used to being closed. The briar caught at their sleeves and hair, thin thorns grazing skin with unpleasant intimacy. The porch boards sagged faintly under their weight. When Ron pushed the door open, it did not creak loudly. It opened too easily. Inside, the air felt undisturbed, not merely empty. Their footsteps sounded wrong on the floorboards, too dull, as though the house absorbed the echo before it could return. Dust lay thick upon the banister. Margot stepped forward first, torch beam cutting a narrow arc through the gloom. The entrance hall stretched long and narrow, wallpaper peeled back in curling strips that revealed cracked plaster beneath. The staircase rose along the wall, its carved banister adorned with wooden vines that mirrored the briar outside. The carvings seemed almost deliberate in their repetition. The sitting room lay to the left. It was larger than expected. The ceiling arched slightly higher. A broad fireplace dominated the far wall, its blackened interior deep and angular. Above it hung a mirror, fractured across its surface in fine spidering lines that caught and broke the light into distorted fragments. A long table stood at the center of the room, draped in a sheet that had yellowed with time. When Peter lifted it, a dust rose in a soft cloud that seemed slow to settle. "Feels theatrical," Ron murmured. Margot did not answer. She was listening. The house did not creak as old houses do. It did not complain under its own weight. It remained almost perfectly still. Peter began setting up his equipment carefully, adjusting knobs, checking levels. The soft mechanical whir of the reel turning felt reassuring human. Margot placed microphones at deliberate intervals, one near the fireplace, one near the door, one beneath the staircase where shadow pooled. Ron managed to coax a fire to life with old dry wood found in the kitchen. The flame rose hesitantly, then steadied, casting warm flickers against cold walls. For a time, the room felt almost welcoming. Almost. They ate, drank, laughed softly at the way their voices seemed slightly delayed in the corners of the room. Margot asked a few tentative questions into the dark, half mocking, half curious. The recorder turned steadily. As midnight approached, the temperature dropped without warning. The fire dimmed slightly, though no log had shifted. Peter adjusted the recorder, leaning close to listen. There, faintly, beneath the hum of the machine and the soft crackle of flame, came something else. Not wind, not the settling of beams, a murmur. Low and layered, as though several voices spoke at once behind a thick wall. Peter's hand froze on the dial. Margot's expression sharpened. Ron swallowed. The murmur faded, then returned, closer. And though none of them could understand the language, they felt instinctively that the house had begun to answer. They tried to pretend the sound had been nothing. That was the first instinct, to laugh it off, to give it a name that belonged to ordinary life. Old pipes, wind through gaps, the house settling. But the longer they sat near the fire, the less convincing those explanations became, because the house did not behave like a house that had been abandoned for years. It behaved like something that had been waiting. The murmur returned in brief pulses. It never rose to full volume, never became clear enough to be mocked, and that was part of its cruelty. It hovered at the edge of comprehension, just beyond the point where fear could be pinned down. Each time it returned, Margot's eyes lifted toward the staircase. Each time Ron's hand found the neck of the bottle, as if warmth could be swallowed. Each time Peter leaned a fraction closer to his recorder, desperate to be certain it was real. At some point, the fire dwindled, and no one moved to feed it. The shadows thickened around the room, pressing closer as the light shrank. The cracked mirror above the fireplace caught the last wavering flames and scattered them into fractured reflections. The house seemed to widen, its corners pulling back into darkness as though making room for something unseen. When they finally lay down, blankets spread close to the dying heat, it was with the strange tension of those who know they will not sleep well but intend to sleep anyway, as if fatigue itself could overrule instinct. Margot fell asleep first, her determination fading into shallow breaths. Ron followed, though his eyes kept darting to the ceiling as if expecting movement. Peter lay awake longest, listening to the slow turn of the reels and the sounds of the house. Somewhere above them, a floorboard creaked once. Then again a few seconds later. Measured. Deliberate. Peter held his breath. No footsteps followed. No one descended. But the sense of being observed did not fade. It only deepened. By morning, the sky outside the window was the color of wet ash. A fine rain fell in straight lines, blurring the hedges and softening the house's silhouette. Their bodies felt heavy, their mouths dry. The fire had collapsed into a smear of cold soot. For a moment, with daylight pushing through the curtains, the sitting room looked abandoned. Ron stretched, forcing a smile. "See? We're fine." Margot did not answer. She was already turning toward Peter's recorder. Peter had rewound the tape carefully, his fingers steady only because he made them steady. When he pressed play, the machine gave its familiar whir, and the room filled with last night's ordinary sounds: laughter, shifting blankets, the fire's final crackle. Then came the murmur. It rose slowly as if sliding up through layers of soil. The hair on Peter's arms lifted. The voices were not one voice, not two. They were many, overlapping, weaving in and out of one another like briar vines, harsh syllables rubbing against the tape with a wet, ancient cadence. Ron leaned closer, his grin gone. "What is that?" Peter didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat felt tight. Margot's eyes shone. "Keep playing." The chant grew stronger, clearer, and Peter felt, with a sick certainty, that it was not simply captured sound. It was directed. A presence leaning into the microphone, aware of being recorded. Then, as if to seal the meaning, an English word whispered through the noise. Not shouted, not spoken conversationally, whispered close, intimate, like breath against skin. "Take care." Peter stopped the tape so abruptly the reels rattled. Silence filled the room. The real silence, not the watched one. "We're leaving," Ron said, voice strained. "Now." Peter nodded immediately, his face pale. "Now, Margot, please." Margot stared at the recorder as if it were a door half opened. "That's proof," she whispered. "You know what people would do for that? Do you know what this means?" "Yes, I do. It means we shouldn't be here," Peter said. Ron rubbed his hands together, as if cold had gotten inside his bones. "One more minute and you'll have to drag me out." Margot's gaze flicked toward the staircase, and for the first time, fear appeared there. Not enough to stop her, but enough to sharpen her excitement into something dangerous. "One more night," she said. "We came for this. We have to see if it answers again. We have to make it undeniable." Peter's voice went thin. "It already is." Margot turned to him, softer now. "Peter, you're the one who wanted the evidence. Don't you feel it? Don't you want to know?" Peter swallowed. Ron looked away. In the end, it wasn't logic that made them agree. It was youth. It was pride. It was the quiet fear of being the one who backed down, the one who would later regret leaving just as the real thing began. So they packed their gear, left the house in daylight, and walked back down Briar End into Wicklow as if returning from a harmless hike. The town watched them from behind curtains and half-open doors. No one spoke. But by late afternoon, shutters were drawn all along Briar End, and no one in Wicklow lit a lamp facing the house. They returned at dusk. The rain had thickened. It fell harder now, turning the lane glossy and dark. The hedgerows leaned inward, their wet leaves brushing shoulders like cold fingers. The black Briar house waited, its outline softened by mist, its roofline sharp against a deepening sky. A single upstairs window seemed faintly different from the others, not brighter, not truly lit, but possessing a subtle depth as if something behind it held a warmer shade of darkness. Ron stopped at the gate, suddenly reluctant. "Does it look closer to you?" Margot stepped forward. "That's the fog." Peter's recorder case bumped against his leg as he pushed through the briar. The thorns caught his sleeve in the same place as before, tearing fabric just enough to sting his skin. He felt as though the house had remembered him. The front door opened again with that too easy sigh. Inside, the air was colder, not the honest cold of an unheated building, a cold that felt intentional. They moved quickly now, speaking less. Peter set up his equipment with the care of someone building a shield. Microphones placed around the fireplace facing the sitting room. Tape threaded precisely, batteries checked twice. Margot positioned the cameras, then adjusted them again, impatient with every shadow that refused to reveal itself. Ron built the fire higher this time. He fed it until flames licked up the stone and the room brightened into something almost comfortable. Margot produced a bottle of liquor. The label was worn, the glass dark. She poured into tin cups. "To courage," she said and lifted hers. Ron drank. Peter hesitated, then drank too, because he wanted something to blunt the edge of his fear. The liquor warmed them briefly, then left a hollow chill behind it. Margot started asking questions into the room, her voice steady, almost formal, as if conducting an interview with something she believed would respond. "Are you here?" she said. Silence. "What do you want?" she asked. Only the fire answered. Ron let out a small breath that might have been relief. "Maybe it's done," he murmured. Peter watched the recorder's reel turning steadily. He tried to focus on the familiar mechanics. on the fact that the tape moved forward in measurable time. Then the candles on the table went out all at once. Not flickering, not sputtering. Gone as if swallowed. The fire dimmed sharply at the same moment, the flames shrinking low and wrong. The sitting room fell into a thin, uneasy half-light where the shadows looked thicker than they should have. Ron stood abruptly. That's... A cupboard door in the kitchen banged open. Then another, fast and violent, as if something invisible raged through the darkness beyond the sitting room. The sound echoed down the corridor like knuckles striking wood. Peter rushed to his recorder. The reel slowed, stuttered, then stopped. He flicked switches, adjusted knobs, nothing. Dead. The cameras blinked once, twice, and went dark. Margot's face tightened. "No," she whispered. "No, don't you dare." The whispering rose. It did not creep in slowly this time. It surged as though released from confinement. The walls seemed to carry it, the ceiling, the floorboards beneath their feet. The foreign chant returned, layered and thick, and through it, close to the microphone, close to their ears, the single English word threaded itself again and again like a nail driven slowly into wood. Taken. The room dropped colder. Peter's breath came out in white, sharp bursts. Something touched his hair. He jerked around, flashlight beams slicing the dark. Nothing. Then his hair yanked backwards so hard his scalp burned. Peter screamed. His body slid across the floor as if dragged by an unseen hand. His heels scraped the boards. His free hand clawed at wood, nails splitting. The force pulling him did not pause, did not hesitate. It was patient and strong like a tide. "Peter!" Ron lunged, grabbing his wrist. Peter's fingers dug into Ron's sleeve. Don't! Ron braced his feet, straining, jaw clenched. Margot rushed forward, grabbing Peter's other arm. For a moment, the three of them held, their bodies locked in a grotesque struggle with something they could not see. Then the fireplace changed. The black interior did not deepen. It seemed to widen. The stone edges looked sharper, the darkness inside thicker. Not empty space, but substance. An opening that felt less like a fireplace and more like a throat. Peter's heels struck the fireplace's stone. He kicked wildly, sobbing. Ron's grip slipped, then tightened again. Margot's hands shook but did not release. The whispering swelled, sounding almost pleased. Then Margot was struck. An unseen force slammed her backward into the wall with enough power to knock the air from her lungs. Her head hit plaster. Her vision blurred. She tried to stand, to return to Peter, but the air tightened around her throat. Invisible fingers closed. Margot gagged. Her feet left the floor. She rose inches, then a foot, pinned to the wall like an insect. Her hands flew to her neck, clawing at nothing, her eyes wide and furious and terrified. Ron screamed her name. The force dragging Peter jerked harder. Ron's hands slipped. Peter's fingers tore free, leaving smears of blood on Ron's skin. He screamed one last time as his head and shoulders disappeared into the fireplace darkness. swallowed not by flame, but by absence. His legs kicked wildly, then were yanked in, the soles of his shoes scraping stone, and then Peter was gone. The scream cut off abruptly. Ron stood frozen for half a heartbeat, staring at the fireplace as if his mind refused to accept what his eyes had seen. Margot still hung against the wall, her face darkening, her breath reduced to wet, strangled sounds. Her eyes fixed on Ron, begging without words. Ron stumbled toward her. He took 2 steps. Then the house hit him. Not a blow he could see, a sudden crushing force that threw him backward. He hit the floor hard enough to rattle the table. Dust burst upward. The whispering surged, now almost intimate, circling his ears like breath. Ron crawled toward Margot again, sobbing, hands shaking. The fire, such as it was, died completely. The sitting room fell into a darkness so complete it felt absolute. Then the mirror above the fireplace reflected something that was not in the room. A hunched figure, hair hanging like wet rope. A suggestion of an old face, not clear, never clear. And a mouth that did not move though the chanting rose as if spoken through it. The reflection lasted only a second, but in that second, Ron understood with terrible clarity that the house did not simply contain the curse. It was the curse. Margot's body convulsed once, then went limp. The grip around her throat released. She dropped to the floor with a dull, final sound. Ron crawled to her and pulled her into his arms, shaking her shoulders, whispering her name, begging her to breathe. Her skin was cold, too cold. The whispering softened to a satisfying murmur. Something scraped along the banister in the hall. Ron looked up. Briar vines had appeared there, thick, wet, black-green ropes curling along the carved wood. They were not growing like plants grow. They were spreading like intent. Ron stumbled to his feet and ran toward the door. He could see it, the dark shape of it. He reached for the handle. The briar moved. A vine lashed across his wrist and wrapped tight. Another coiled around his ankle. A third snapped around his throat, thorned and slick, puncturing skin. Ron screamed, clawing at it, his fingers torn by thorns. The vine tightened with slow certainty, dragging him backward inch by inch. He screamed again, louder. Then the vine yanked hard. Ron's body slid across the floor and vanished into the hall darkness, dragged toward the staircase where the shadows pooled thickest. His screams echoed up the stairwell, then rose into a gurgle, then stopped. Silence returned to the Black Briar house, a silence so complete it felt deliberate. Outside, the rain continued to fall. The upstairs window remained dark. And in Wicklow, far down Briar End, people slept fitfully behind bolted doors, listening not for footsteps, but for the absence of them. Morning arrived dull and colorless. The fog lay low over the fields. Briar End looked like a lane drawn in charcoal. No one saw the 3 teenagers walk back into town. No one heard their voices. No one saw them carrying their gear. By midday, a rumor moved through Wicklow with the quiet speed of dread. By evening, it became certainty. Still, no one went to the Black Briar house. Not the farmer who had warned them. Not the older woman who had shut her door. Not even the men who liked to think themselves brave. They knew what it meant when the house was fed. Wicklow gathered fearfully around the idea of absence. They lit candles behind curtains for souls that might already be lost. They spoke prayers softly as though volume might attract attention. Briar End remained empty, the gate half ajar, the briar wet and glistening. The house did not demand witnesses. It had taken what it wanted. Years passed. Wicklow remained Wicklow, gentle on the surface. Tourists arrived in summer, taking photographs of cottages and hedgerows and smiling in the soft light. They rarely wandered towards Briar End, and when they did, locals redirected them with practiced ease. But legends do not die in quiet towns. They attract the curious. One late autumn evening, another season of rain and fog and early darkness, a new group arrived in Wicklow. Older than Margot and Ron and Peter had been, but not wiser. They carried bright torches and laughed too loudly, as if laughter could banish superstition. They found Briar End. They pushed through the gate, and the Black Briar house opened for them. Inside, the sitting room looked much as it always had. Dust, sheets, the broad dark fireplace. The cracked mirror above it was gone, leaving only a darker stain on the wall. The air smelled of damp wood and old ash and something faintly sour beneath. One of them found a heavy box beneath a rotten sheet near the fireplace. "A recorder," he said, delighted. "Old reel to reel." They gathered around it, amused by the relic. Someone brushed dust from the switches and laughed at the mechanical weight of it. "Think it works?" a woman asked. They found a plug, a battery pack, a switch that clicked with satisfying certainty. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the reels began to turn. A soft mechanical whir filled the room. Static hissed through the speaker. And beneath the static came distant voices. Young voices trapped on tape like insects in amber. Laughter, footsteps, the crackle of fire. The newcomers smiled. One of them leaned closer. A chant that seemed to thicken the air in the room as it played. Their smiles faded. The whispering grew louder. And through it, clear as breath against glass, came a single English word. "Taken." Every candle flame in the room went out at once, and the tape continued to turn. The Haunted Lighthouse. Greystone was a town that never seemed fully awake. Even at midday, the light came thin and colorless, as if the sun had lost interest halfway there. The gulls cried, but their voices sounded distant, muffled by the fog that rolled in each dawn and forgot to leave. Doors swelled with damp and seldom opened. Windows gathered salt like old wounds. People moved quietly here, speaking in half whispers, as if they feared that raising their voices might stir whatever else listened beneath the wind. And down by the harbor, where the tide scraped at the stones, the sea never looked blue, only gray, as though it too had tired of reflection. He fit there in a way because he too had gone quiet. His name was Edric Fenlow, and 6 months before his story begins, he had been a husband. Now he was a widower, though that word felt too tidy for what had happened. His wife, Moira, had not simply passed. That was what the doctor said, and what they put in the parish ledger. But Edric had been there. He had seen what the others had not. He had seen her look not at him, but past him, over his shoulder, eyes wide and glassy, as if someone had spoken her name from the corner of the room. He had seen the lamp gutter for no reason, and he had felt the draft, though every window was shut tight against the February frost. He had heard her say, in the smallest, strangest voice, "They've come early." Then she was gone. The doctor said heart, the minister said will of God, the neighbors said poor thing. But Edric knew none of those words belonged in that room. There had been something there, unseen but sure as tide, and once Moira was gone, the house had never been right again. There were small sounds in the hallway at night. The rocking chair on the back porch would sway though the air was still, and sometimes, God help him, he would smell her lavender soap in an empty bathroom. He did what many men do when the world stops making sense. He turned to the bottle. Greystone did not have much, but it had the drunken gull. The tavern stood crooked at the end of Lantern Row, its walls darkened by centuries of smoke and pipe soot. They said it was older than the town itself, a place where privateers once sat with wet boots and heavier purses, where customs men had been bribed and sailors had vanished. The floor was uneven plank, the beams black and low, and the only light came from candles stuck in pewter holders and lanterns with glass so smoked you couldn't be sure if the flame inside really burned. On storm nights, the wind would push the door half open, and nobody would get up to close it, because nobody in Greystone would dare to keep the lost from finding their way back inside. Edric became a regular. Men who'd known him as a tidy, quiet cooper, good with his hands, sober as a judge, now saw him slumped at the far end of the bar, coat still on, hat rim wet with fog, staring into a glass of cheap whiskey like there might be answers at the bottom. Behind the bar was a broad-shouldered, slow-moving man with sea-gray eyes and the look of someone who had seen too many winters and not enough springs. Everyone called him Old Bram. He polished the same spot on the counter even when it didn't need it, listened more than he talked, and had a way of lowering his voice when the story began to bend toward the supernatural. The sailors came, as they always did, crewmen of the Rachel May and the Morning Star, trawlers from the northern coast, a couple of whalers when there was work, and when the drink had run through them and the lamps burned low, the talk turned. Talk of the drowned girl who could be seen walking the beach at low tide, hair dripping, never lifting her face. Talk of the bells no church had ever owned, heard in the thickest fog, calling no one to worship. Talk of the ship with no flag, seen far out in the mist, moving though no sail was set. And more than once, talk of the lighthouse. The lighthouse stood on Raven Crag, a jagged spit of black rock 3 miles out, where the breakers came in hard and the fog sat like a watchful thing. It was visible from town only on clear days, and there were fewer and fewer of those. Some said it had been built in the 1830s by a mainland company. Others said it was older, on the foundation of something that had stood there before men kept records. It was high, narrow, and pale, like a bone stuck in the sea. The light still burned only because the harbor authority insisted on it and shipped oil once a year. But nobody lived there now. "Man'd be a fool to," one sailor said once, staring into his mug. "It keeps itself," another muttered. Old Bram did not always add to such talk, but on the 4th or 5th night of Edric's grieving, when the whiskey had softened him and the tavern was down to sailors, smoke, and the slow creak of the sign outside, the barkeeper leaned in. "You've heard tell of the Raven Crag light?" Bram said, wiping his hands. "But I doubt you've heard it true." Edric looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed and watery, his beard untrimmed, his hands big and scarred around the mug. "True," he echoed, half mocking, half hoping. Bram glanced down the bar. The men nearby hushed, not because he asked them to, but because they had been waiting for this. "A man's meant to tend a light," Bram went on. "That's the way of it. Lanterns don't fill themselves. Oil don't carry itself up 70-odd steps. Windows don't clean themselves after a gale. But that one," he jerked his chin towards the sea, though you couldn't see it through the tavern wall, "that one don't like to be left. You go out there and it keeps you." "Like hell it does," scoffed a fisherman with a scar on his cheek. "You ever seen the keeper come back?" Bram asked mildly. The man opened his mouth, then shut it. Bram continued. "The harbor sends a man, sometimes two, sometimes with a dog. Says, 'We'll be back at year's turn with oil and papers. Keep her burning.' That's the charge. Always the same. But the man don't come back. Boat goes out, boat comes back. Empty. Year after that, they send another. Same. Happened so many times the office stops sending men from here, starts sending strangers. Men without families. Drifters. Sailors who lost a leg. Men who don't ask questions. Still the same. Raven Crag keeps them." "How?" Edric said. His voice was low, but steadier than it had been in weeks. He was listening, truly listening, the way he used to listen to Moira hum in the evenings. Bram shrugged. "Some say there's no danger except the sea, slippery rock, bad storms. No doctor close. That's one way to tell it. But there's this other way." He paused to let the smoke drift between them. "They say it was built where some folk got left behind long before this town. Left on the rock when the boats moved on. Left to starve and listen to the gulls. Left to stare at a fire that never reached them. Some say the light's a calling, not a warning. Some say the house below, the keeper's room, never stays empty, even when there's just one soul there. They say you hear footsteps going up when you're coming down. They say doors open in the night. They say," he lowered his voice, "they say some men out there start to see faces in the lens when they trim it, and that once the light knows your face, it don't let you go." "Doesn't let you go, huh?" Edric repeated softly. He drank. The whiskey was bad, but it was warm. Bram tilted his head. "That's what I heard. Maybe that's the point. The barkeep watched him. Point. Maybe a man goes out there not to come back. There was a little silence in the dark tavern, filled only by the lick of candle flame and the distant crash of waves. After that night, the idea would not leave him. He tried staying in Greystone. He had tried walking the same streets where Moira had bought bread, where she had stopped to talk to Mrs. Fenwick about the price of mackerel, where she had stood with him on Sundays outside the churchyard. Every corner held her, and every corner kept refusing to give her back. He had tried staying in the house, her shawl still over the chair, her sewing still in the basket, her smell still on the pillow. But that was worse. The house became a mocking thing, a place that still remembered her, even though the world did not. So when the harbor office posted on a damp morning in April a notice in the window, "Keeper wanted, Raven Crag Lighthouse, 1-year term, pay on completion, room and board provided, must be sound of body, clean of record," he stood there longer than a man should stand and read a simple poster. "Don't," said the clerk behind the glass, seeing him looking. "You're local. You know better." Edric looked at him and, in a voice strangely clear for a man who had spent months in smoke and whiskey, said, "I'll take it." The clerk stared. "Mr. Fenlow, that's a year," Edric said. "Just a year." "Most don't make a year," the clerk muttered. "Then I'm a most." The clerk ran a hand through thinning hair. "You have anyone to speak against it? Family?" Edric shook his head once. No one to stop him. No one to miss him. No, that wasn't true. There was Jack. Jack was an old dog, steady, broad-backed, and faithful, who had followed Edric home from the docks a year ago and simply never left. Moira had laughed and fed him chicken scraps. Now, without Moira, Jack had taken to lying on the front step of the house as if to guard it against emptiness. "You can take the dog," the clerk said grudgingly. "Some men do." "Then I will," Edric said. "He deserves a place that's not listening for her feet." 2 weeks later, on a morning when the fog was thick enough to chew, Edric stood on the pier with 2 trunks, a crate of books, 3 oilskins, a battered lamp, and more bottles than he would ever admit to anyone. Jack sat at his heel, tail still and patient, as if sensing that what waited ahead would not be kind. The dock hands eyed the luggage but said nothing. They'd seen men go to Raven Crag with less and return with nothing. A boat was waiting, manned by 2 harbormen who did not look at him over long and did not speak once they pushed off. Greystone receded. The leaning tavern, the crooked masts, the rope coils, the faint bells of St. Agnes, the mouth of the river. Then nothing but white. Out of the fog, the lighthouse appeared, sudden and near. A pale tower on a black fang of rock, its base washed again and again by the cold Atlantic. The keeper's house was a low, stone-built thing pressed against the tower's side. The whole place looked like it had been forgotten. The paint had peeled, ironwork rusted, windows filmed with salt. The men helped him off, past his trunks, his crate, his oil, his bottles, his dog. They did not tie up, only held the boat against the ladder. "We'll be back next April," the older of them said without meeting his eye. "First week if the ice breaks. You need to signal anything sooner, you fly the red. If it's bad, bad, you fly the black. Might not come if it's blowing." "Understood," Edric said. "You keep the flame ever burning," the man recited as if from duty. "I keep the flame ever burning," Edric answered. The boat pushed off. In seconds, it was swallowed by the mist. The quiet that followed fell unbroken. He stood on the wet stone, Jack beside him, and listened. Nothing but waves, gulls, and faint high above, the slow glassy breath of the lantern turning. "Well, boy," he said at last, his voice sounding strange there, "this is us." Jack sneezed at the salt. The first few weeks passed in silence. Edric read by lamplight, mended what he could, wrote a few half-hearted diary entries in the logbook left behind by the last keeper. The handwriting stopped mid-sentence. Nights were worst. The sea sounded different out here, heavier, closer as if it were breathing. The light needed tending at all hours, and sometimes when he climbed the stairs, he swore he heard steps just ahead of him. At first, he thought it was the sound of his own boots echoing off the stone, but one night he stopped mid-step, and the footsteps kept climbing. Jack would lift his head, ears twitching, and growl at the door, though nothing ever came. Once, in the dead hush between waves, the dog's hackles rose so high Edric thought the animal might tear itself apart from fear. The next morning, claw marks scored the wood of the door, deep, fresh, and higher than any dog could reach. The air inside the tower began to change. Some nights smelled faintly of smoke, others of brine and decay, as if the sea had come inside without opening the door. His lamp would go cold, though the wick still burned. The mirror in his quarters sometimes clouded from the inside, as if something on the other side of the glass were breathing out. Then came the whispers. Not words at first, just the murmur of many voices behind the stone, rising and falling like a tide. But sometimes he caught fragments.
"Edric, down below. Trim the light."
He told himself it was the sea. The sea made all sorts of sounds when a man was alone long enough. But once when he opened his eyes in the dark, he saw a shape standing at the foot of the bed. Thin, salt white, the outline of a man with his head bowed low as if listening. It vanished when he spoke. After that, the line between waking and sleep began to blur. He would dream of the lamp room and wake to find himself there, trimming the flame with no memory of rising from bed. He would hear the gears turning above him, though the mechanism lay still. And once, as he passed the narrow window halfway up, he saw a reflection in the glass that wasn't his own. A face pale and hollow-eyed, gazing out toward the mainland. Then one night in December, Edric woke to the sound of the lens turning, though he had wound it down hours earlier. The flame burned steady, but its light fell strangely. Every rotation, the shadows seemed to move the wrong way, cross the wall, up the stairs, down the hall. He stood watching it for almost an hour until something brushed against the back of his neck. A faint, cold touch like wet lace. When he turned, there was nothing. But the light above him flared, and in the polished brass he thought he saw, for the briefest instant, Moira's face, pale and dripping, staring back. He whispered her name. The flame shuddered. the room went dark. Days blurred. His entries grew uneven. He began to hear voices beneath the wind, faint overlapping murmurs. A woman's laughter once. Moira's. He found the rocking chair on the landing moving one morning. It faced the sea. Jack barked at it until Edric whispered, "Hush, lad, let her sit." But that night he dreamed of her again, standing at the top of the stairs, white and pale and dripping with seawater. "Edric," she said, "you let it in." He woke with the taste of salt on his lips. By February, the logbook entries had become fragments. The glass fogs from inside. "Jack won't go near the lamp room. I think I've been hearing the sea inside the walls." The last entry came on a night of heavy storm. Moira was right. They've come early. When the supply boat came next spring, no one answered the bell. The man climbed the ladder and found the door half open. Inside, the air was stale, faintly sweet with lamp oil and rot. On the stairs halfway up, they found Jack, long dead, still curled as if waiting. At the top, in the lantern room, they found Edric Fenlow, hanging by his belt from the great iron brace above the lens. The light still burned. They cut him down and looked for the logbook. The last page was blank, except for a single faint print of a wet hand. They buried him on the rock itself near the base of the tower. The next keeper never came. And to this day, on calm nights when the fog lies heavy over the water, the people of Greystone say the light of Ravencrag turns by itself, and that if you stand on the pier and listen close, you can still hear the faint creak of footsteps climbing the endless stairs. There is something in the fog. Mornwick Hall lay beyond the reach of ordinary roads, as though it had been placed there by error and never corrected. It stood upon a rise of stone and ancient earth, surrounded on three sides by marshland that surrendered itself twice a day to the tide. At high water, a narrow channel revealed itself, winding like a reluctant vein through reeds and gray water, permitting passage by boat alone. At low tide, the land closed again, swallowing all approach. It was said, by those who spoke of it at all, that the fog came every night. Thomas Calderwick arrived in the late afternoon when the light was already thinning and the water lay slack and dark beneath the hull of the small boat that brought him in. He watched the manor emerge gradually from the haze, its irregular towers and steep roof lines resolving themselves piece by piece, like a thought forming against resistance. Calderwick was a man who trusted in ink, evidence, and the orderly collapse of nonsense under examination. He had made a modest reputation in London by exposing frauds of a spiritual inclination, and the idea that a country house might devour its guests offended his reason. That people should vanish without trace suggested not a spirit, but a circumstance, one poorly observed and poorly reported. He intended to observe it properly. Mr. Edgar Martin received him at the threshold. The butler was tall, spare, and dressed in a fashion that had not altered in decades. His face bore no expression or welcome of warning, only a kind of professional endurance, as though he had long ago accepted a duty he could neither abandon nor explain. "You are expected," Morton said. Calderwick smiled. "I should hope so." Inside, the hall was vast and cold, its stone floor worn smooth by generations of passing feet. A fire burned low in the great fireplace, though the air remained stubbornly chill. Somewhere above them, the building creaked, not with age, but with adjustment, like a body settling into sleep. "You will not leave the house after nightfall," Morton said as he took Calderwick's coat. "That seems an odd rule," Calderwick replied. "It is an old one. I have no intention of wandering the marsh in the dark," Calderwick said lightly. Morton paused, then inclined his head. "Intentions," he said, "are not always consulted." At supper, Calderwick met the only other residents of Mornwick Hall, Henry and Margaret Brimley. They were seated close together, as though the distance between chairs were a thing to be feared. Age had not made them frail so much as careful. Every movement seemed measured, every word considered before it was allowed to leave the mouth. "You'll be leaving in the morning, then?" Miss Brimley said, almost hopefully, once introductions were complete. "Not if the story proves worth the journey," Calderwick replied. Mr. Brimley lowered his eyes to his plate. "It always does," he said. Later, as dusk gave way to night, they gathered in the great hall before the fire. The flames threw long, uncertain shadows across the stone walls, shaping faces where none ought to be. Outside the tall windows, the fog pressed nearer, obscuring the glass until it seemed the hall floated in a white and shifting sea. Brandy was poured. It tasted old, as though it had waited a very long time to be drunk. "You've heard the stories?" Calderwick said, more to prompt than to ask. "That people go out when the fog comes and never return." "Yes," said Mr. Brimley. "And before you say it, no, they are not exaggerations." Mrs. Brimley folded her hands. "When we first arrived," she said, "we laughed as you do now. We thought the fog and inconvenience, nothing more." "And the first to disappear?" Calderwick asked. "A governess," Mr. Brimley replied. "Miss Harrington. She stepped out to fetch her shawl from the garden path. The fog came quickly that night. We heard her call once, only once." Mrs. Brimley closed her eyes briefly. She sounded puzzled, as though the world had altered without warning. Another story followed. A merchant from the north, stout and confident, who wagered a sovereign that he could walk to the edge of the marsh and back before the fog thickened. He was heard laughing somewhere beyond the reeds. The laughter ended abruptly, as if a hand had been laid across his mouth. Then a young married couple, guests of only 3 nights. They were heard arguing beyond the window, their voices muffled, distorted, until the argument dissolved into pleading. "And the house?" Calderwick asked quietly. Was it always like this? No, Mr. Brimley said. It learned. He explained that Mornwick Hall had once been a place of modest hospitality used by families waiting out tides, storms, or illness. People stayed, people talked, people left. Until one winter, Miss Brimley added, when the fog did not lift for 3 days. On the third night, a child vanished. No one saw her go, she said, but afterward, the doors began to open by themselves. Calderwick shifted, discomfort creeping in despite himself. You speak as though the house remembers, he said. It does, said Mr. Brimley, and it repeats. A sound passed through the hall then, a soft, deliberate footstep upon stone. Calderwick turned sharply. Someone else awake? Mr. Morton stood near the wall, hands folded behind his back. No, he said. The fire snapped. Outside, the fog pressed closer. That night, as Calderwick retired, Mr. Morton appeared beside him in the corridor with such suddenness that Calderwick startled. You should not have stayed, Morton said. I intend to leave in the morning, Calderwick replied. Morton's expression twitched, not quite a smile. You will intend many things, he said. The house listens politely. It rarely agrees. You speak as though this place were alive. I speak as one who was watched it learn, Morton replied. Why stay? Calderwick asked. The butler regarded him steadily. Someone must close the doors, he said, and sometimes open them. The whispers began shortly after midnight. At first, they were distant, nearly mistaken for wind and stone. Then they grew more deliberate. Names, half-spoken sentences, fragments of regret. Calderwick opened his door. The corridor lay empty, lit by a single lamp at the far end. As he watched, a door farther down the passage opened slowly, though no hand touched it. Later, in the gallery overlooking the hall, he encountered them more clearly. Figures stood where no one ought to be, pale, incomplete, as though memory itself had taken shape. They did not speak, but watched him with expressions of expectation, even hope. One stepped forward.
I thought,
it whispered,
that morning would come.
Calderwick fled. By the fourth night, his skepticism lay in ruins. Reason could not account for a house that rehearsed its dead, not for fog that waited like a listener at the edge of light. He resolved to leave at once, but the fog had come early. The channel was gone, the marsh was lost. The world beyond Mornwick Hall had ceased to exist. That final night stretched endlessly. Doors opened and closed. Footsteps circled his room. Voices called him gently, persuasively, promising guidance through the fog.
You won't be alone,
they said. By morning, the fog lay smooth and unbroken. Henry and Margaret Brimley found Calderwick's room empty. his bed untouched, his coat gone. Mr. Morton stood at the threshold and looked out into the white. "He went out?" Mrs. Brimley said. "Yes," Morton replied. "They always do, in the end." Weeks later, another guest arrived. In a drawer of the abandoned room, he found a leather-bound notebook. He read it by firelight, frowning at the final lines, written in a hand that had lost all certainty. "The fog is not empty. It is full of those who believe they would return. If you are reading this, do not wait for morning." The guest closed the book, unsettled. Outside, the fog began to rise, and Mornwick Hall waited. She Who Walks with the Lantern. Ashwick was the sort of village that did not appear on most maps. It lay folded deep within a cradle of black woods where the trees grew tall and close, and the sky was often reduced to a narrow strip of pale silver between crooked branches. The road that led there was little more than hardened earth and memory. In winter, it vanished entirely beneath frost. In autumn, it drowned in leaves. Few travelers found Ashwick by accident, and fewer still passed through without remarking on the stillness. The houses were old, Victorian in build, steep-roofed and narrow, their brick darkened by damp seasons and creeping ivy. Iron fences leaned inward as if listening. Window panes were warped with age, and when candlelight burned within, it trembled strangely, as though disturbed by a draught no one else could feel. The villagers did not speak loudly after dusk, and on nights when the moon rose full and pale above the treetops, Ashwick changed. Doors were bolted early, shutters drawn, candles snuffed before midnight. Even the stray dogs found shelter. For Ashwick held a legend older than the tavern beams and deeper than the graves in its cemetery. They spoke of her in lowered tones, she who walks with the lantern. No one agreed on when she had first been seen. Some claimed she had appeared the very year Ashwick was founded. Others insisted she had walked the forest long before the first chimney was raised. What they agreed upon, what none dared dispute, was this: when she was seen, someone would die. She appeared only on moonlit nights, always at a distance, in narrow alleyways where shadows pooled thick as ink, between the trees beyond the village edge. Once reflected in the warped glass of a bakery window long after it had closed. She never spoke. Her lantern never flickered in the wind. And the one who saw her would lose someone they knew. Whether she caused the death or merely walked ahead of it, no one in Ashwick could say, but no one doubted the pattern. At the heart of Ashwick stood the Weeping Willow. The tavern was older than most of the houses surrounding it. Its beams were dark oak, hand-hewn and bowed with age. A carved willow tree hung above the door, its wooden branches forever drooping. The glass in the windows was thick and imperfect, blurring the world beyond into wavering shapes. Inside, the ceiling sagged low over broad timber beams blackened by decades of smoke. The fireplace was wide and deep, its stones soot-stained and warm even in spring. Iron hooks hung from the crossbar above the fire, and kettles simmered slowly there long after the last meal was served. The floorboards were uneven, polished by generations of boots. Candles burned in pewter holders along the tables, their wax dripping into hardened constellations. The air always carried the scent of oak smoke, ale, damp wool, and something faintly sweet that might once have been apple. It was not merely a tavern, it was a shelter. Within its walls, Ashwick felt momentarily safe. The legend had never crossed its threshold. The woman with the lantern had never been seen inside. Old Garrick had kept it so. He was a broad-shouldered man despite his years, his hands thick and scarred from a lifetime of hauling barrels and splitting wood. His beard had long since gone white, but his eyes remained sharp and steady. He moved slowly behind the bar, but not weakly. When he spoke, others listened. He had lost 3 friends to the lantern's appearance. He did not tell their stories lightly. Helping him were Ruth and Doris, who kept the inn rooms above in order and the tavern tables full. Ruth moved with quiet competence, her dark hair always tied back, her gaze observant. Doris was quicker to laugh, quicker to startle, her hands light as she carried trays between tables. On busy nights, the fire roared and voices rose high. On moonlit nights, conversation stayed close to the fireplace. Victor Hale arrived in Ashwick on a damp afternoon in early autumn. He did not look like a man lost. He carried himself easily, his coat well worn but well kept, his boots sturdy. His face bore the faint lines of travel and weather, but he remained handsome at a quiet way. His eyes were attentive, thoughtful. He listened more than he spoke. He had stories, one could see that, but he did not offer them freely. When he stepped through the door of the Weeping Willow, conversation paused only briefly before resuming. He was greeted politely, offered ale, shown a seat near the fireplace. Ruth noticed him first. He thanked her when she set down his drink, looked at her properly, not through her. There was warmth in his smile. Not boldness, not arrogance, but something steady. He stayed. 1 night became 3, then a week. Victor seemed drawn to the stories of Ashwick. Not mocking, not dismissive, but curious. He had traveled, he said, had seen strange customs and stranger beliefs. He did not deny the supernatural outright. He simply did not accept that a ghostly figure could command death itself. Patterns, he once said softly by the fireplace. Grief creates them where coincidence would suffice. Old Garrick did not argue. He only watched him. The night they shared their stories came beneath a full moon. The tavern was near full, though the windows were shuttered. The fire crackled high. Outside, the forest stood silver and still. Old Garrick poured slowly. Victor sat at the long oak table near the fireplace. Beside him was Elias Mercer, the village gunsmith, a deliberate man with steady hands and a habit of polishing his spectacles he did not need. Across from them sat Harold Fenwick, Ashwick's night watchman, whose shoulders stooped under invisible weight. Near the fire stood Arthur Duncan, the gravekeeper, thin and pale, his coat perpetually dusted with soil. Ruth moved quietly between them. Doris hovered closer to the bar than usual. It was Harold who spoke first. "I saw her by the cemetery gate," he said, staring into his mug. "Lantern low at her side. Didn't hear a step. Didn't see her face. Just the light." The fire snapped sharply. "And who died?" Victor asked gently. "My sister," Harold answered. "She stopped breathing." Arthur Duncan shifted in his chair. "She walked the graves last winter," he murmured. "Stopped at 3 plots. I know which ones. Dug them myself within a week." Victor listened carefully. "And you believe," he said, "that she chose them?" Arthur did not answer. Elias Mercer spoke next. "My apprentice saw her in the reflection of my shop window," he said quietly. "Thought it was a woman behind him. Turned. No one there. His uncle died the following day. Fell from a ladder." Doris crossed herself subtly. Victor leaned back, thoughtful. "Men fall," he said. "Grief connects what fear insists must be linked." Old Garrick's voice cut through the warmth. "You haven't seen her." The tavern fell silent. Victor met his gaze. "No," he admitted. Ruth said another drink before Victor, her fingers lingering only a second longer than necessary. "Then don't," she whispered. He smiled faintly. "I don't fear shadows." Outside, something moved in the trees. No one went to look. 2 nights later, a light was seen in the forest. Harold reported it, swore upon it. The following morning, a rider arrived at Ashwick bearing a letter. Victor read it at the tavern table, the seal broken with steady fingers. His father had died suddenly. No illness, no warning. Victor did not speak for some time. That evening, the full moon rose again. He stood before the fireplace of the Weeping Willow and addressed the room. "If what you say is true," he said, voice calm but firm, "then this ends tonight." Ruth stepped forward. "Victor," he turned to her gently, "if she walks ahead of death, then she may walk no further here." Old Garrick said nothing. Elias Mercer handed Victor the pistol without flourish. 6 shots, he said quietly. Victor did not look back when he stepped beyond the last lantern-lit window of the Weeping Willow. The door closed behind him, and with it went warmth, voices, the crackle of oak, and the faint scent of ale. Ahead lay only the road, silvered by thin moonlight, and beyond it, the dark shoulders of Ashwick's forest. The night felt wider than usual, too wide. He moved with steady purpose, boots pressing into damp earth, the pistol heavy in his hand, but not unfamiliar. Elias had shown him its balance. 6 chambers, 6 clean shots. He did not rush. The trees received him without sound. Branches arched overhead like the ribs of something long dead. The air cooled immediately, thick with loam and old leaves. Somewhere far behind him, the village seemed to exhale, and then vanished entirely. Victor listened. At first there was wind, a faint stirring high above, the distant call of an owl. Then, gradually, even those sounds thinned. The forest did not grow louder in his presence. It grew quiet. He became acutely aware of his own breathing, of the pulse in his ear, of the faint scuff of his boots against bark. Then he saw it. A light. Small at first, almost mistaken for a trick of the eye. A warm ember floating between trunks. He did not stop walking. The light held steady. It did not sway as a carried lantern should. It did not flicker in the breeze. It simply existed. Closer now. He could make out a faint outline of a figure around it. Tall, slender, draped in something that absorbed the moonlight rather than reflected it. "Enough!" Victor called, voice steady but carrying. The figure did not answer. The lantern remained low at her side. He stepped closer. "Why?" he demanded, anger sharpening the edges of his calm. "Why my father?" No reply. Now he could see her fully. Her form was that of a woman, yes, but softened at the edges, as though the night itself blurred her shape. Her dress hung long and dark, trailing slightly without disturbing leaves. Her face, he tried to focus. It was pale. Her eyes were shadowed hollows beneath the brim of the lantern's glow. The lantern's flame burned steady and unnaturally calm. Its glass was old, fogged, yet the light within was unwavering. "You took him," he said, more quietly now. "You chose him." The woman tilted her head almost imperceptibly. Or perhaps it was only the shifting of light. His hand tightened around the pistol. "If you walk ahead of death," he said, voice hardening, "then you walk no further." He raised the weapon. She did not move. He fired. The flash split the dark, bright and violent. The recoil jolted his arm. The bullet passed through her. Through. The lantern flame did not tremble. Victor stared. There was no wound, no tear, no recoil of fabric. The shot had struck nothing that could be struck. He swallowed, fired again, and again. Back in the weeping willow, the first shot cracked through the air like splintering wood. Conversation froze. Ruth's hand stilled mid-motion. A second shot followed, distant but sharp. Doris gasped. The third echoed longer, bouncing between trees. 4, 5, 6. Then, silence. No scream. No falling branch. Just the steady murmur of wind through leaves. Ruth stood rigid, hands clasped tight. Doris wept softly. Old Garrick stared into the fire, the light of it reflecting dull in his eyes. "He won't come back," he said at last. Morning came gray and cold. A forest keeper found him hanging from an old oak at the forest's edge. The rope was tied cleanly. The pistol lay empty in the leaves below. There were no footprints but his own. They buried Victor Hale in Ashwick's cemetery. Arthur Duncan dug the grave. Ruth stood long after the others left. That night, the moon rose full once more. And in the distance, between the trees, some say a lantern burned steady and warm, walking slowly toward the road. She who walks with the lantern does not hurry. And in Ashwick, doors are still bolted early when the moon is bright. For though men may fire bullets into shadows, the lantern never goes out. The Beast of Black Hollow. They arrived at Black Hollow in the late afternoon, when the year had already begun to turn inward on itself. Autumn had settled deeply there. The air was cold and damp, carrying the faint smell of peat and standing water, and a pale fog lingered between the low hills and the dark line of woods that encircled the village like an unbroken fence. The road that led them in narrowed as it went, as though it had once been wider, but had since been reclaimed by neglect and moss. Linda was the first to feel it. She did not say anything at first, only slowed her pace slightly as they passed the first of the houses. They were old, unmistakably Victorian, their brickwork darkened with age, their windows tall and narrow, their porches sagging under the weight of years. Lamps burned behind thick glass, but the light seemed reluctant to escape into the street. "It's like the place is holding its breath," she said at last. Ron laughed. "That's what villages do when strangers turn up." Jess glanced at him, then at the houses. "They're watching us," she said. "Everyone watches newcomers," Howard replied mildly. "It's human nature." Tyler said nothing. He walked a step behind the others, his eyes never leaving the fog that crept in thin strands along the edges of the street. They found the inn at the center of the village, a low, broad building with a hanging sign that creaked softly in the wind. A black raven was painted there, wings half spread, its beak open as if in warning. "The Raven," the sign read. The door opened with a heavy sound and warmth spilled out to meet them. Conversation died the moment they stepped inside. It was not dramatic. No one turned openly. No one stared. The silence simply arrived, thick and complete, like a curtain drawn across a stage. A dozen eyes lowered to glasses and plates. Someone coughed. Somewhere a chair scraped softly against the floor. "Well," Ron muttered, "aren't we popular?" The innkeeper looked up from behind the bar. He was an older man with a broad face and tired eyes. He studied them for a long moment before nodding once. "Rooms?" he asked. They nodded, suddenly grateful for something so ordinary as a transaction. Keys were handed over. Supper was served. Stew thick with root vegetables and bread still warm from the oven. Beer followed. Slowly conversation returned to the room, though it remained cautious. After the second round, Linda leaned forward. "We heard about the legend," she said lightly. "The one about the beast?" A few patrons stiffened. One man stood abruptly, leaving his drink untouched, and went out into the fog without a word. Another shook his head. "Children's stories," he muttered, though his hands trembled as he lifted his glass. An older woman leaned close, her voice low. "You leave tonight," she said. before the moon climbs. Ron smiled. And miss all the fun? That earned him a look of naked fear. You don't understand, she whispered. It comes to feed. Laughter followed, too loud, a little unsteady. A pair of men at the far table, already well into their drink, began arguing over details. How tall it was, how fast, whether it could be killed. Their words slurred, their eyes bright and unfocused. Wolfman, one said. Beast, said another. Devil in fur, said a third. The innkeeper slammed a glass onto the bar. That's enough, he said. Then more quietly to the five of them. Here's a map. Make sure to be back before darkness falls. Linda smiled, thanking him. Ron rolled his eyes. They took the map and left. Outside, the village lay empty. Doors were closed. Windows darkened one by one. Lanterns burned on porches, their light barely reaching the street. Above them, clouds thinned, and the moon, full and pale, began to rise. They walked without speaking. The cemetery lay at the edge of town, its iron gate hanging open. Headstones leaned at odd angles, names worn smooth by time and rain. As they entered, something moved between the rows. The graveyard keeper appeared as if from the earth itself. A tall, thin man wrapped in a heavy coat, his face deeply lined. You shouldn't be here, he said. They jumped. Howard recovered first. We're just looking around. The man shook his head slowly. This is the wrong night. Tyler swallowed. Why? The keeper's eyes flicked to the moon. Because it won't stop once it starts. Stop what? Ron demanded. The man stepped back, already retreating into shadow. Leave Black Hollow, he said. Now. Then he was gone. They laughed it off afterward, but the laughter did not last. They walked farther from the cemetery than they intended, guided more by instinct than decision, until the village lights were no longer visible, and the ground began to soften beneath their feet. The marshland lay open before them, dark water reflecting broken fragments of moonlight, and beyond it the woods rose thick and unbroken, their edges blurred by mist. Here they stopped. Ron declared it far enough. Howard agreed, unfolding the map once more, though it offered little comfort now. Linda knelt and began arranging stones for a fire, her movements deliberate, almost ritualistic, as though repetition itself might impose order on the night. When the fire finally caught, it burned low and steady, its light pressing back the darkness only reluctantly. Shadows gathered just beyond its reach, deep and layered, as if the woods were leaning closer to listen. For a while it felt almost normal. They sat close together, passing bottles and murmuring jokes that came too quickly, as though silence might invite something unwelcome. Ron held court, retelling the graveyard keeper's warning, mimicking the man's voice until Jess laughed despite herself. You should have seen your face, Ron said to Tyler. I thought you were going to bolt. Tyler forced a smile. He didn't sound like he was joking. No one ever does, Ron replied. That's how legends work. Howard leaned forward, warming his hands. Legends usually grow from something real, he said. A wolf, a murderer, a story passed down until it loses its edges. And gains claws? Jess asked. Howard shrugged. Fear fills the gaps. Linda listened without speaking. Her gaze kept drifting toward the trees where the firelight failed. I don't think it's just a story, she said quietly. Ron snorted. Of course you don't. You want it to be real. I want to understand it, Linda replied. That's different. Jess studied her. What do you think will happen? Linda hesitated. I think something will come close enough for us to know we shouldn't have stayed. Tyler shifted uneasily. He reached into his pack and produced a string of garlic, holding it up like a charm. For protection, he said weakly. Jess burst out laughing. That's vampires. Ron wiped tears from his eyes. Well, if the beast's Italian, we're saved. Even Tyler laughed then, the sound thin but genuine. For a moment, the night loosened its grip. The fire popped sharply. They all fell silent. From the woods came a sound. Low, drawn out, and deliberate. It was not a growl exactly, nor a call. It carried weight, intention. Did you hear that? Jess whispered. The sound came again, closer this time. Branches shifted somewhere beyond the light, cracking softly under pressure that was far too measured to be wind. Howard frowned. Probably an animal. And then they heard it move. Not toward them. Around them. The sound passed behind the fire, then to their left, then farther back, always just beyond the edge of light. Something exhaled, a wet, steady breath that stirred the fog near the ground. Tyler's laughter died in his throat. It's breathing. Ron stood abruptly. Enough! He stepped toward the trees, firelight clinging briefly to his back before surrendering him to the dark. Come on! He shouted. You want to scare people? Show yourself! The woods accepted him. For a moment, nothing happened. Then came the scream. It was short, sharp, and terrible. Cut off as though something had closed a hand around his throat. For a heartbeat, none of them moved. The fire dimmed. Somewhere in the darkness, something heavy shifted, and the sound of it stepping forward carried clearly now. The night drew inward, and the nightmare began. They ran. Branches clawed at their faces and arms as they fled blindly toward the village, the ground uneven beneath their feet, roots and stones threatening to send them sprawling at every step. Their breath burned in their chests, each gasp sharp and painful, as though the cold air itself were cutting them open from within. Behind them came the sound of pursuit. It was not the crashing, careless noise of a beast forcing its way through undergrowth. It was faster than that, purposeful, close enough that they could feel it, a pressure at their backs, a presence that seemed to fill the darkness between the trees. Linda stumbled. It happened so quickly that Jess did not realize at first that Linda was no longer beside her. There was a sharp cry, more of surprise than pain, and then a sound that none of them would ever forget. A deep, tearing snarl followed by the sickening crack of bones. They did not look back. The cemetery gate loomed ahead, its iron bars gleaming faintly in the moonlight. They burst through it and ran among the leaning stones, their shadows stretching grotesquely across the ground. At the far edge stood the small keeper's hut, its door hanging crookedly on its hinges. They threw themselves inside and slammed the door shut. The darkness within was thick and close. Jess pressed her back against the door, her heart hammering so violently she feared it might give them away. Tyler collapsed onto the dirt floor, shaking so badly he could not stand. Howard stood in the corner of the hut, his face pale, his eyes wide and unfocused. "It's still out there," Tyler whispered. No one answered him. They listened. Outside, something moved among the gravestones. Footsteps, slow now, deliberate, passed close to the hut, then receded. A low sound followed. Not quite a growl, not quite breath. Jess covered her mouth with both hands. "This isn't possible," Howard murmured. "It can't be." "It killed them," Tyler said. "Ron, Linda." Howard shook his head as if to clear it. "No, there has to be an explanation. Some kind of animal or people." Jess turned on him, her voice breaking. "Did that sound like an animal to you?" Silence answered her. Minutes stretched into something longer, heavier. Time lost its edges. The cold seeped through the thin walls of the hut, settling into their bones. Every sound outside felt amplified. The creak of branches, the whisper of grass, the distant splash of something moving in the marsh. Howard wiped his hands on his jacket, leaving dark streaks of sweat. "I'll check," he said at last. Tyler's head snapped up. "No, don't! We can't just stay here." Howard insisted, though his voice trembled. "If it's gone, if there's a chance." "There isn't," Jess said quietly. Howard hesitated, his hand hovering over the door. For a moment it seemed as though he might listen. Then he opened it. The night rushed in. A massive shape surged forward impossibly fast. There was a single terrible glimpse of fur and red light, and then Howard was wrenched from the doorway with a cry that cut off mid-syllable. The door swung shut on its own. Jess and Tyler did not move. They did not speak. They sat in the darkness, listening to the sounds outside fade once more into silence, until silence itself became unbearable. When they finally ran, it was without looking back. The inn was in sight when the howl split the air. They turned. The creature stood before them, towering, furred, eyes burning red. "I told you to leave," it said. The moonlight shifted. Claws receded. Fangs dulled. The graveyard keeper stood there, human once more. "Go," he said, "and never return." Dawn broke. They ran. Years later, Black Hollow still stands. The inn still opens. The lanterns still burn. And once a year, when the moon is full, no one leaves their home. Because the beast feeds, and the hollow remembers. deep in the woods. There are places on the map that look empty on purpose, not because nothing exists there, but because the land itself seems determined to be forgotten. The roads grow thinner the farther you go, until they become little more than pale scars between fields and hedgerows. The last houses appear quiet and half asleep, their windows dim, their gardens turned inward. Past them, the world changes. Trees gather. The air cools. Sound begins to behave strangely, as if it does not travel the way it should. The locals had a name for those woods. Though it was never written anywhere official, it was the kind of name that passed from mouth to mouth like a warning, spoken softly and only when necessary. They didn't say the forest was dangerous in the way a cliff is dangerous or a river in flood. They said it was wrong. Not always, not to everyone, but especially on certain nights when the cold came early and the moon shone full and sharp as bone. That was when the legend returned. They said a ghost haunted the woods. Not a person with a face, not a spirit that spoke in clear words. Something older, at least something that no one could properly describe. Some swore it looked like a man standing between the trees. Others insisted it was only fog, a thick silhouette of mist shaped briefly into something human before collapsing back into nothing. Those who claimed they had truly seen it tended to tell their stories with strange pauses, as though remembering too much made their mouths go dry. The most consistent part of the legend was always the same. If you entered the forest on a cold autumn night under a full moon and you encountered the apparition, you would not leave unchanged. You would begin to hear things that weren't there. You would begin to see things that weren't there. And the forest would start to feel less like a place you were walking through, and more like a place that had decided to keep you. Derek and Paul had heard the story the way all boys hear certain stories, half laughing, half listening, filing it away as something to test once they were old enough to pretend they weren't afraid. They were friends in the way boys often are at that age, constant, competitive, inseparable. Derek was the one who smiled first and spoke faster, always eager to prove he wasn't impressed. Paul was quieter, but his curiosity ran deeper. He asked questions. He noticed small things. He was the one who remembered details of old stories while others forgot them. On the night it began, they were at Derek's house for a sleepover. The wind pressed cold against the windows. The air smelled faintly of rain that had not yet fallen. Derek's room was lit by a single lamp on the desk, its light spilling softly over comic books, snack wrappers, and the folded blanket Paul had brought from home. They had been talking about nothing in particular until, as it always does, conversation wandered towards what frightened them. Paul brought it up first, as casually as he could. "My uncle says it's real," he said, staring at the ceiling as if speaking upward made it less serious. Derek snorted. "Your uncle says everything's real." "He doesn't scare easy," Paul insisted. "He said he went in there once. He said he heard someone calling his name from between the trees." "That's just owls," Derek replied automatically, though his voice was a shade less confident than his snort suggested. Paul turned his head. "Owls don't call your name." Derek opened his mouth, closed it, then said, "It's just people messing around." "Then let's go," Paul said, and when Derek stared at him, Paul added quickly, "Not now, tomorrow night. Full moon. We just look around. Prove it's nothing. Derek laughed, loud enough to cover the small flicker of unease that passed through him. You really want to go ghost hunting? Paul shrugged, forcing himself to look relaxed. Why not? We've got flashlights. We'll stick to the path. We'll be back before midnight. Derek sat up straighter. And if we see something? Paul hesitated. In that pause, the wind tapped the window once like a knuckle. Then Paul said, Then we'll know. Derek's grin returned, sharper now. Fine, he said. We'll go, and we'll prove it's a stupid story. They shook on it, a quick, childish gesture made solemn by the fact that both of them understood in some unspoken way that the plan had already crossed from game to challenge. That night, when the lamp was off and the room was dark, neither of them slept easily. The following evening, the cold arrived early. The sun went down behind a low bank of clouds, leaving the world bruised and gray. By the time Derek and Paul left Derek's house, the moon had risen above the fields, full, bright, and strangely sharp, as though it had been cut out of ice. They walked along the edge of the road, flashlights in their pockets, breath showing faintly when they spoke. The houses thinned behind them. Streetlights became fewer. The sound of town life faded until there was only the soft hiss of wind moving through dry grass and the occasional distant bark of a dog. When they reached the tree line, Derek stopped. The forest stood ahead like a wall. The trees were tall and close together. Leaves clung in damp clusters, dark and heavy, and the spaces between trunks looked deeper than they should have, as if the woods held more darkness than the night outside them. Paul shone his flashlight toward the entrance. The beam cut into the first row of trees and then seemed to dim, swallowed by shadow. Even the air looked thicker inside. Derek swallowed, pretending it was nothing. "This is it?" he asked, forcing a lightness into his voice. Paul nodded. "This is it." They stepped in. The temperature dropped almost immediately. The wind outside became muted, as if the forest had shut a door behind them. Their footsteps sounded different on the leaf litter, softer, less certain. The path, if it could be called that, was a thin line of earth winding between trunks. For the first few minutes, nothing happened. They walked and talked in low voices, laughing at their own nerves. Derek pointed out ordinary things: a broken branch, a rabbit track, a knot in a tree that looked like a face. Paul kept shining his light into the deeper spaces between the trees, as if expecting something to appear. The deeper they went, the less Derek spoke. The forest had a way of making sound feel wrong. Even the smallest noise, a leaf shifting, a twig snapping, carried too far, echoing oddly. Sometimes the echo came from the wrong direction. Paul stopped once and listened. "Did you hear that?" Derek frowned. "Hear what?" Paul's flashing wavered. "Someone walking?" They both held still. Silence pressed in around them. Then, from somewhere ahead, a soft crack sounded. The unmistakable snap of a branch underfoot. Derek's heart jumped. He forced a laugh. Probably a deer. Paul didn't laugh. They continued, slower now, and the path began to feel less like a path and more like a suggestion. The trees grew thicker. The moonlight above was broken into thin, pale fragments by branches. Their flashlights became the only solid thing in the darkness. Then Derek saw it. At first he thought it was fog, a pale shape between the trees drifting low. But the night was cold, not wet enough for mist, and the shape did not behave like fog. It moved with intention, sliding forward and then stopping as if it had noticed them. Paul saw it too, his breath caught sharply. The shape stood among the trees at a distance, pale against the dark, and as they stared, the fog gathered into something like a silhouette. Not clear, never clear, just enough to suggest shoulders, a head, a human stance. Derek whispered, "Is that?" Before he finished the thought, the air changed. A sound rose from the woods. Not one sound, but many, layered. A faint whispering, like voices carried on wind, though the forest was windless. The whispering did not come from one place. It came from everywhere at once. Paul turned in a slow circle, flashing beam darting. "Who's there?" he called, his voice cracking slightly. No answer, but the whispering continued. Then, very softly, Derek heard something else. A voice. Not in the air ahead of him, but close, as if spoken directly in his ear. His blood went cold. He spun, flashlight beam slicing behind him. There was nothing. Paul stared at him. "What?" he demanded. Derek's mouth was dry. "Nothing," he lied, and the lie felt so wrong in the cold air. The fog silhouette shifted. It seemed closer now, though neither of them had seen it move. It was simply closer, as if the distance had been removed without warning. A twig snapped behind them. Paul jumped. Then another snap, to the left. Then one to the right. The forest began to crack and creak in small, deliberate sounds, as though invisible feet moved through the leaves just out of sight. Paul grabbed Derek's sleeve. "We should go," he said, urgent now. "We should go back." Derek nodded too quickly. "Yeah," he breathed. "Yeah, fine." They turned, intending to retrace their steps. But the path behind them did not look the same. It should have been a thin line on earth. It should have been easy. Turn around, follow the same route out. Instead, there were only trees. The same trunks, the same dark leaf litter, the same scattered pale moonlight. Derek shone his flashlight in widening arcs, searching for the familiar gap between two crooked birches where they had stepped over a fallen branch. It was gone. Paul's voice went thin. That's not right." Derek tried to steady himself. "We just turned the wrong way, that's all." Paul shook his head. "No, we came in straight. We didn't..." A whisper rose again, closer now, pressing in. Paul flinched as if something brushed his cheek. Derek's flashlight beam caught movement, fog shifting between trees, and for a moment he saw the silhouette again, nearer than before. The shape did not advance like a person. It simply appeared nearer, the fog thickening into a suggestion of a face that was never fully formed. Derek backed away. His foot caught on a root and he stumbled. Paul grabbed him and hauled him upright. "Run," Paul whispered. They ran. Their flashlights bounced wildly, beams darting across bark and leaves. The forest seemed to rearrange as they moved. Trees appeared where there had been space. Branches snagged their clothes. The ground rose and fell unpredictably beneath their feet. They stopped after what felt like minutes, gasping, and found themselves at a place neither of them recognized. Derek stared around in disbelief. "Where are we?" Paul shook his head, his eyes wide. "We're lost." Derek tried to laugh, but it came out as a broken sound. No, we just..." A voice whispered from the darkness to their right. Paul froze. Derek turned his flashlight toward him. Paul's face had gone pale. "You heard it?" Derek said, almost pleading. Paul nodded slowly. "Yeah." The whispering rose again, heavier, closer. It was no longer merely sound. It felt like presence, like breath on the back of their necks, like eyes behind their shoulders. Derek's throat tightened. "We need to find the road." They tried. They chose a direction and walked quickly, then stopped and chose another. Every time they thought they saw an opening, the trees closed around it. Every time Derek called out, the sound seemed to fall dead after a few feet, as if the forest swallowed it. Once, in the thin moonlight, Derek saw the fog silhouette ahead again, standing between two trunks like a man waiting. He stopped so abruptly Paul ran into him. "It's there," Derek whispered. Paul shone his flashlight. The beam hit fog and scattered through it, turning it briefly into a pale shimmering outline. For a heartbeat, the silhouette looked almost solid. Shoulders, head, the suggestion of arms hanging at its sides. Then the beam moved and the shape dissolved, spreading thin across the ground like mist. But the whispering remained. Paul's voice shook. "We're not supposed to see it." Derek swallowed. "What do you mean?" Paul stared at him, fear making him honest. "The legend. Once you encounter it, you start hearing things, seeing things." As if to prove the point, Derek heard a laugh, low and soft, from somewhere behind them. He spun. No one. Only trees. Only dark. They tried again to find their way out. They argued briefly, then fell silent because speaking felt like wasting air. They found the same fallen log twice. They passed the same twisted stump 3 times, even though they swore they had not turned in circles. Time behaved strangely in the woods. The moon seemed fixed above the branches, unmoving. And the forest grew quieter the longer they searched, as if it were listening. At last, exhausted and trembling, they stopped beside a tall tree unlike the others. Its trunk was massive, older, its bark deeply ridged. The branches above it spread wide, blotting out more moonlight than the rest. The ground around it was bare, as if nothing dared grow close. Paul sank down at its roots, chest heaving. "We can't keep running," he said. Derek leaned against the trunk, his hands shaking. "We can't stay here either." Paul looked up, eyes reflecting faint moonlight. "Dawn," he whispered. "We wait for dawn. When the sun comes up, we'll see the path. We'll find the road." Derek wanted to argue, but his legs felt like they belonged to someone else, heavy and numb. The cold had seeped into him. His thoughts came slowly, like words spoken in a dream. He nodded. They sat close beneath the old tree. Paul wrapped his arms around his knees. Derek kept his flashlight in his lap, fingers clenched around it as if it were a weapon. The whispering faded. For a moment, there was only their breathing and the faint drip of moisture from branches. Derek's eyes kept scanning the darkness between the trunks. Every time he blinked, he thought he saw the fog silhouette shifting at the edge of his vision. A pale suggestion, never fully there, always just beyond the point of certainty. Paul whispered, "Do you see it?" Derek's voice came out hoarse. "I don't know." Silence pressed close again, thick and drowsy. The trees behind them felt strangely warm through their jackets. Not comforting warmth, but something like the faint heat of a living thing. Derek's eyelids grew heavy. Paul's head drooped forward. They fought sleep for a while, terrified of what might happen if they closed their eyes. But exhaustion is a slow poison, and fear cannot keep it out forever. Derek's flashlight beam weakened, then steadied, then weakened again. Paul murmured something, not words, just a sound, and slumped against the trunk. Derek leaned his head back. The last thing he heard was a whisper moving through the leaves like breath. Not his name, not Paul's, something softer, something that sounded almost like relief. Then the word slipped away. Dawn came to the forest. No shout rose from the tree line. No two boys stumbled out onto the road with pale faces and shaking hands. They found no footprints, no torn fabric, no recorder, no flashlight. In the weeks that followed, people began to speak again of the old legend. More softly now, with less laughter. They spoke of the fog silhouette, of voices that called your name when no one was there. Of the way the woods grew quiet under a full moon, as if listening. And on certain cold autumn nights, when the moon rose full and sharp above the tree lines, there were those who stood at their windows and watched the forest from a distance. Some claimed they saw it then, a pale shape between the trunks, standing perfectly still, not beckoning, not chasing, only waiting. The ghost in the woods did not need to hunt. It only needed someone curious enough to enter. And the town, for a long time after Derek and Paul vanished, locked its doors early when the moon was bright. Because the legend was no longer just a story told at sleepovers. It had names now. And it was alive. The Graveyard Keeper. In the quiet valley of Hollowbrook, where the mist drifts low over the fields and settles among the rooftops like a pale and watchful sea, there stands an old cemetery upon the northern rise. The people of the town rarely speak of it by its proper name. Officially, it belongs to the Church of St. Peter, whose narrow bell tower rises above the valley and can be seen from almost every road leading in or out of Hollowbrook. But the villagers do not call it that. To them it is simply the graveyard on the hill. And there are many in Hollowbrook who will not look at that hill after dark. The cemetery is older than the town itself. Its oldest graves were there before the first cottages were built in the valley below. Time has bent the stones at odd angles. Moss has swallowed names. rain has worn dates smooth. Many of the dead who lie there are now remembered by no one, and the graves themselves seem to lean together like old men whispering secrets that should not be heard by the living. A narrow path winds upward from the town, through thorn bush and long grass, to an iron gate whose hinges complain bitterly whenever it is opened. Beyond the gate, the paths between the graves twist like pale veins through the dark earth. Yew trees stand watch over the dead, their branches black against the sky. On windy nights, they groan and sway like mourners too tired to weep. At the center of the cemetery stands the old chapel of St. Peter. It is a small chapel, built of dark stone that seems to absorb moonlight rather than reflect it. Its windows are narrow and old-fashioned, and the wooden door has warped with age so that it must be shouldered open on damp evenings. Beside it sits a weathered cottage with a sagging roof, one crooked chimney, and a fence that has long since ceased trying to be straight. And in that lonely cottage lives the graveyard keeper. For more than 40 years, that keeper has been Thomas Duncan. To the people of Hollowbrook, he's little more than a figure of uneasy familiarity. A stooped old man in a long coat too thin for winter and too heavy for summer. A man with gray in his beard, hollows beneath his eyes, and a lantern that never seems to leave his hand. A man who walks the cemetery after dark when no decent soul has any business among graves. A man who mutters to himself in the fog and pauses beside headstones as though listening for replies. The villagers have their own explanations for him. Some say the years spent burying the dead drove him out of his mind. Some say he drinks himself numb to pass the nights. Others insist that grief, loneliness, and too much wind on that high hill have worn his senses thin. And a few, though only a very few, and only when the tavern is nearly empty and the fire burns low, claim that if one stands at the foot of the hill long enough, one may hear Thomas Duncan speaking in the graveyard and hear another voice answering him from the dark. But the sensible people of Hollowbrook dismiss such talk. It is the easiest way to live in a place like Hollowbrook. There are some things that are simpler if called foolishness. There are some fears that lie more quietly when mocked. And besides, very few among them have ever climbed that hill late enough to discover whether Thomas Duncan truly walks there alone. The winter before the events of this story began, the priest of Hollowbrook passed away in his sleep. He had been old even by the town's memory, the sort of man who seemed always to have existed, as fixed a part of Hollowbrook as the river bridge or the chapel bell. He had baptized children who had themselves grown old, buried husbands and wives who had once sat hand in hand in the front pew, and spoken more than one eulogy in a voice so gentle it had made strong men cry in silence. When he died, the church bells rang for him 3 times in the pale light of morning, and the sound drifted far across the valley. Not long after, the diocese sent a younger man in his place. His name was Father Nathaniel O'Connell. He arrived on a gray afternoon in early autumn when the fields were damp, the sky hung low over the valley, and the river below the bridge ran cold and brown from recent rain. He came with 2 trunks, a box of books, a traveling coat, and the quiet self-possession of a man who had spent far more time among papers and lectures than among isolated villagers with old superstitions. Father O'Connell was thoughtful, polite, and sincere. He was not arrogant exactly, but he possessed the calm confidence of an educated man who believed that the world, though often painful, was still ultimately orderly. He believed in God, in discipline, in charity, in the comfort of ritual. But he did not believe in superstitions. He did not believe in wandering spirits, cursed places, or things that rose from the grave when the moon was full. It did not take long for the people of Hollowbrook to bring up the hill. At first, the warnings came casually. A woman arranging flowers in the churchyard remarked that the cemetery path became treacherous in the dark and was not worth using after dusk. A shopkeeper, wrapping bread in paper, mentioned that old Duncan was a peculiar sort and best humored from a distance. Then, one evening at the tavern, while the fire snapped low and rain tapped softly at the windows, a farmer leaned across the table and lowered his voice. "You'll want to stay clear of the graveyard after dark, Father." Father O'Connell smiled mildly. "For the fear of ghosts?" The men at the table exchanged glances that were too quick and too serious to be entirely comfortable. "For fear of Duncan," another said. "He's not right in the head after sunset." A third laughed, though not with much conviction. "That hill does strange things to a man's mind." Father O'Connell thanked them for their concern, but dismissed the matter inwardly. The explanation seemed obvious enough. A lonely old laborer, too much time among graves, perhaps too much whiskey, perhaps too little sleep. And yet, in the evenings that followed, the priest noticed something he could not entirely explain. From the rectory window, he could see the graveyard hill. And every night, a faint yellow lantern light appeared among the graves. It moved slowly, wandering in patient paths between the stones. Sometimes it paused for a very long time. Sometimes it vanished behind the chapel and reappeared somewhere else entirely. And it never went out until morning. Curiosity, as it often does, overcame caution. It was late afternoon when Father O'Connell first climbed the hill to meet the keeper. The air smelled of damp earth, moss, and the sharp faint rot of fallen leaves. The gate complained when he pushed it open. Ravens perched on several leaning stones and watched him with hard black eyes as he entered. He found Thomas Duncan kneeling beside a freshly turned grave near the far edge of the cemetery. The old keeper rose slowly as the priest approached. He was taller than Father O'Connell had expected, though his back had begun to bow with age and labor. His beard was thin and gray, his cheeks weathered, his coat dark with old wear. But what struck the priest most was not his appearance. It was the expression in his eyes. They were not eyes of a cheerful drunkard or raving fool. They were tired, profoundly tired. In Duncan's hand hung the lantern. It was an old thing, iron-framed, heavy, and stained with age. The glass was clouded, and the metal clasp bore rust in tiny veins. Yet there was something oddly careful in the way he held it, as though its weight mattered. "You must be the new priest," Duncan said. His voice was low and rough, but steady. "Yes," Father O'Connell replied. "Nathaniel O'Connell." Duncan nodded once. Then his gaze drifted past the priest, over the graves, toward the coming dusk. "You should not come here after dark." Father O'Connell smiled in the manner one uses for troublesome but harmless men. "I'm not afraid of the dead, Mr. Duncan." At that, the old keeper looked back at him more sharply. "No," Duncan said quietly. "It is not the dead you ought to fear." The priest gave a small, polite laugh. "And what then?" Duncan did not answer at once. He seemed to be listening. The wind moved softly through the long grass. "When the moon rises," Duncan said at last, "you must stay away from this hill." There was no jest in his voice. Father O'Connell thanked him, asked after the condition of the chapel roof, and made a few remarks about repairs the church might see to before winter. Duncan answered these practical matters well enough, but his attention remained divided. Twice he glanced toward the old graves behind the chapel. Once he even tilted his head as if he had heard something very far away. The priest assumed drink. Nothing else made sense. He took his leave as the western sky dimmed. There was something in Duncan's warning that had not sounded like drunken fancy. Something too plain, too wary, too practiced. And so the priest watched. Every evening, Thomas Duncan lit the lantern before sunset. Every evening, he walked the cemetery paths. Sometimes he paused before certain graves and seemed to speak. Sometimes he stood entirely still, the lantern hanging at his side, his head slightly inclined as if listening to a voice too soft for others to hear. Once, from the rectory window, Father O'Connell even thought he saw Duncan nod in reply to someone unseen. He reproached himself for indulging in foolish imagination. Still, his unease grew. One particularly cold night, several days after their first meeting, Father O'Connell was returning from a sick call at the edge of town when he heard it. The sound came thinly through the mist from somewhere on the slope above. Voices. He stopped at once. One of them was unmistakably Duncan's, low, tired. The other was unlike any ordinary voice he had ever heard. It was faint and papery, like dry leaves dragged across stone. There was a shape to it, the cadence of speech, yet the words were hard to catch. More than once the wind seemed to pass through it. The priest stood listening, his heart beating a little faster than it should have. Then he began climbing the path. The mist thickened as he rose. The gate loomed ahead, black and wet with dew. And just as he reached it, the whispering stopped. The silence that replaced it was sudden and complete. He entered the graveyard and found Thomas Duncan standing beside a narrow, cracked headstone. "You were warned," Duncan said without turning. Father O'Connell drew himself up. "Who were you speaking to?" Duncan slowly faced him. The lantern in his hand cast an ember ring over the grass and stones, leaving the rest of the cemetery to darkness. "You hear them, don't you?" he asked. The priest listened. He heard only the wind. No. At that, Duncan's expression changed, not to relief, but to something closer to pity. Then pray you never do. Father O'Connell demanded a proper explanation. Duncan refused him one. He only repeated that the hill was no place for the priest after dark and resumed his walk among the graves. The priest left angry, unsettled, and more determined than before to uncover the truth. It was 1 week later that Thomas Duncan finally told him about the lantern. The conversation took place at dusk beside the chapel wall, where the stone still held a little warmth from the day. Father O'Connell had gone up intending to speak plainly and, if necessary, to insist that Duncan stop frightening the townsfolk with muttered nonsense. Instead, he found the old keeper cleaning the lantern with a rag and a gentleness usually reserved for relics. "What is so special about that thing?" the priest asked. Duncan glanced up, then back at the metal frame. "It is older than the chapel." "That cannot be known." "It can," Duncan said, "because the chapel was raised over the old ground, and the lantern was already here." Father O'Connell frowned. "What old ground?" Duncan did not answer directly. "Every keeper has carried it," he said. "The man before me, the man before him, and the one before that, as far back as the records go." "So it is a tradition?" Duncan gave a small, humorless smile. "If tradition is what you call a chain placed round one man after another." The priest remained silent. Duncan's fingers moved over the rusted latch. "This lantern does not simply give light, Father. It reveals what the night would rather keep hidden. Some of the dead lie quietly enough, as they should. Some do not. Some rise in spirit only. Some only whisper. Some scarcely know they are dead at all." He paused. "And some remember it too well." Father O'Connell looked at him for a long moment. "You expect me to believe that after sunset you converse with the dead?" "I do not expect you to believe anything. I only expect you to stay off this hill when the moon is full." The priest opened his mouth to answer, but before he could speak, Duncan's head turned sharply toward the chapel yard behind them. "What is it?" Father O'Connell asked. The old keeper was already on his feet, lantern in hand. A scraping sound had begun somewhere among the stones. It lasted only a moment, then ceased. Duncan listened a little longer, then relaxed, though only slightly. "Nothing yet," he muttered. The priest heard the words. The yet in them troubled him more than the rest. That night, unable to settle, Father O'Connell sat long by the fire in the rectory with a book open and unread upon his knees. Around midnight he rose, put on his coat, and went out. He told himself he was going only to prove the matter ridiculous. The moon was not yet full, but it was waxing and bright enough to silver the mist lying low over the valley. By the time he reached the graveyard gate, his breath smoked in the air and his shoes were wet with dew. Inside, the cemetery lay under a drifting veil of fog. The lantern light moved ahead among the stones. Father O'Connell followed it carefully, keeping to shadow where he could. Duncan walked with the certainty of a man who knew every inch of the ground. His boots made almost no sound. Every so often he paused, tilted the lantern, and turned his head as if hearing something approach that had not yet arrived. At last he stopped before one of the oldest graves in the cemetery, a lopsided headstone so eaten by weather that no name remained upon it. Duncan lifted the lantern slightly. "Not tonight," he said. The priest frowned. He had heard no one else. Then the earth moved. It was subtle at first, a shiver through the soil, a faint settling. And then Father O'Connell heard them. Voices. Not one, not two. Dozens. Soft, overlapping, and impossibly close beneath the ground. They did not rise from any single point. They seemed to breathe up through the whole cemetery at once, a murmur of dry throats and buried mouths.
Let us out.
The priest froze. The earth before Duncan bulged upward. A pale hand, gray with clotted mud, pushed through the soil. Then another hand joined it. The ground tore open further, and something began dragging itself out of the grave. It had a vaguely human shape, but only in the way a nightmare may resemble a memory. Its arms were too long, the joints wrong. The face sagged as though melted, features slipping and reforming in the sickly green light of the lantern. One eye was buried deep in the ruin of the skull, while the other shone too brightly, like a wet stone held to moonlight. And when it spoke, many voices spoke with it.
Duncan,
it whispered.
You promised.
The old keeper's face hardened with the wary irritation of a man confronting some old, unavoidable nuance. Back into the earth. The thing's head tilted.
You keep us starving.
The whispering beneath the cemetery grew louder. All around them, the ground started to twitch and swell. Fingers appeared through the soil in grave after grave. Pale knuckles, black nails, bits of wrist with clinging grave cloth. The priest stumbled back, horror breaking through disbelief so completely that for a moment he forgot even to pray. The creatures in the open grave laughed.
We are not alone,
it said. And suddenly Father O'Connell understood that what stood before them was not a single spirit wearing one broken form. It was several. Something in that grave had gathered the dead together like rot gathers flies. Duncan slammed the bottom of the lantern down against the earth. The green flame roared bright, far brighter than any ordinary lamp ought to burn. Light rushed outward in a hard circle, and where it touched the malformed thing, the creature convulsed. The many voices became one long shriek of rage and pain. The hands pushing from the nearby graves recoiled. Soil collapsed inward. In seconds, the grave swallowed the creature back down. At last silence returned. Father O'Connell stood shaking. Duncan did not even look at him. "That was a quiet night," the keeper said. The priest nearly left Hollowbrook the next day. He considered it seriously. He walked the church alone in the early morning and tried to order his thoughts beneath the carved beams of St. Peter's. He told himself what he had seen might have been a fit, a vision, some madness caught like fever from listening too long to a madman's talk. Yet he knew better. He had heard voices beneath the earth. He had watched a thing rise from a grave. The memory of that wet, layered whisper followed him like a draft in every room. That evening, driven less by courage than by the need to understand whether horror has rules, he returned to the hill and demanded the truth. Thomas Duncan gave it to him in pieces. They sat outside the keeper's cottage while the last of the light faded over Hollowbrook below. The cemetery was not consecrated first, Duncan said. That was the mistake. Long before St. Peter's was raised, this hill was old ground. Burials without prayers, plague pits, punishments. Men hanged and dumped, women buried in secret, children with no names. The old keepers knew it. The church built over it and hoped stone and scripture would settle what was beneath. And did it? For a time. Duncan's gaze rested on the lantern. But the ground was never empty. Some places are thin, Father. The world wears through there. The hill is one of them. He told the priest then of the full moon. Not every night brought trouble. Most nights the dead lay quiet enough, or nearly so. Some whispered from habit. Some wandered in spirit and could be turned back with a word. But on full moon nights, the old boundary weakened. The graves loosened. Things buried deep remembered movement. Spirits that had forgotten their names remembered hunger instead. "And the lantern?" Father O'Connell asked. Duncan was quiet a long moment before answering. "The lantern binds the keeper to the hill. It lets him see the dead and command what still answers to burial law. So long as he bears it, the town below is spared the worst of what rises." "The worst?" Duncan looked down toward Hollowbrook, where a few lights had begun appearing in cottage windows. "If I leave them to themselves," he said, "they go looking for warmth, for breath, for prayer, for flesh. Sometimes they only want to be seen. Sometimes they want to be remembered. But there are others." He shook his head. "Others want replacement." The priest frowned. "Replacement for what?" "For themselves." Duncan would say no more that night. But the unease in his face made it clear enough that the answer, when it came, would not be gentle. The moon waxed fuller. So did the dread in Father O'Connell's thoughts. He considered telling the town. No, they would think him madder than Duncan. So he kept silent and watched the moon grow. One afternoon, he climbed the hill to find Duncan mending a broken section of fence beside the chapel. The keeper looked worse than before, drawn, pale, and even more tired, if such a thing was possible. "You haven't slept," Father O'Connell said. Duncan drove a nail into the wood with slow, deliberate strikes. "Not enough." "Because of the full moon?" "Because they know it's coming." The priest hesitated. "Can all of them speak?" "In one fashion or another." "And do they know you?" "Oh, yes." There was something in the keeper's voice that made Father O'Connell uneasy. "In what way?" he asked. Duncan stopped working. "The way prisoners know the man who locks the gate." That evening, just before sunset, Father O'Connell witnessed one of Duncan's nightly rounds up close for the first time without hiding. The old keeper lit the lantern. The flame caught with unnatural ease, as though the wick had been waiting. At first it was ordinary enough, golden, small, steady. But as Duncan walked among the graves, it changed. Not in color exactly, but in character. The light seemed denser, almost aware. It pooled where it chose and left other places dark. Once it brightened suddenly beside an unmarked grave, and Duncan immediately stopped. "Who's there?" Father O'Connell asked. Duncan listened. Then he spoke softly into the dark. "Go back." The priest heard nothing. A few seconds later, however, the long grass beside the grave bent as though someone unseen had slowly lowered themselves to the ground. He stared. "You saw that," Duncan said. "Yes." The keeper nodded once. "That was only a child." Father O'Connell did not know whether that made him feel better or worse. The full moon rose 3 nights later. All day a pressure seemed to hang over Hollowbrook, though the sky itself remained clear. Dogs barked at nothing and would not settle. The church bell rope snapped clearly in the vestry, though no one had touched it. More than one villager complained of strange dreams. An old woman refused to let her grandchildren out after sunset and would not say why. By dusk, the valley seemed to be holding its breath. Father O'Connell climbed the hill early and found Duncan already waiting by the chapel door. The old keeper carried the lantern unlit. The moon lifted slowly above the eastern ridge. The instant its light touched the cemetery, Duncan lit the lantern. This time the flame sprang up fierce and hard, throwing long shadows in every direction. The glass seemed less clouded than before, as though the light within had burned away its age. The ring of brightness stretched further than the priest had yet seen. And then the ground began to move. Not one grave, not a few. Dozens. Soil trembled. Headstones shivered in their sockets. Cracks opened in old earth. The sound was terrible, not for its loudness, but for its number. A hand tore through the soil near the path. Another rose beside the chapel. Father O'Connell's faith did not leave him, but comfort did. Thomas Duncan moved at once. With the lantern raised, he strode from grave to grave, shouting in a voice the priest had never before heard from him. "Back! Back into the ground with you!" Some of the dead obeyed immediately. Upon hearing him, they stilled, shuddered, and sank. Others hesitated, as if struggling to remember the shape of submission. Duncan would thrust the lantern toward them, and the light seemed to strike them like a physical force. They recoiled and dropped back into darkness. But not all. Some continued rising. A woman in a burial gown blackened with damp lifted herself from the earth with rigid, insect-like motion. A man missing half his jaw dragged one leg after him and made no sound at all. The priest whispered a prayer. The thing smiled. And then the lantern light touched them fully. What until then had seemed merely corpse-like changed before his eyes. A shape rose from the ground beside Father O'Connell so suddenly that he almost cried out. It was not a corpse. It was a standing darkness, tall and thin, made of smoke that did not disperse. Faces appeared inside it, pale, stretched, open-mouthed, each visible for no more than a second before another replaced it. Some seemed screaming, some praying, some laughing soundlessly. The shadow leaned near him. The smell that came from it was of old graves opened in rain.
The lantern shows truth,
it whispered. Its voice was not loud, yet every syllable seemed to bypass the ear and settle directly behind the priest's eyes. It lifted one long arm and pointed toward Thomas Duncan. The priest turned. The keeper was halfway across the cemetery, driving back a cluster of newly risen dead with the lantern held high. And in that terrible, pitiless light, Father O'Connell saw what the shadow meant him to see. Duncan's body was no longer solid. The outline of him remained, the coat, the hands, the face he knew. But beneath the flesh there was no flesh, no bone, no blood, only darkness. Father O'Connell stared in disbelief. Thomas Duncan turned as though he had heard the priest's thought. For an instant the keeper looked directly at him, and in his eyes the priest saw the awful downing of the same realization. The shadow beside him whispered again.
He is one of us.
The cemetery erupted. Whether the risen dead sensed Duncan's moment of weakness or merely obeyed some deeper rhythm of the moon, Father O'Connell never knew. But suddenly many more graves gave way at once. Soil burst upward in sprays. Stone cracked. Several coffins split under the pressure from beneath. And then came the voice. It was deeper than the whispering thing from the earlier grave and far older. If the others sounded hungry, this one sounded patient.
Keeper.
Thomas Duncan stiffened. The priest saw true fear in him then, for the first time. Do not answer, Duncan called hoarsely. But the voice was not speaking to the priest. It had never wanted the priest first. It wanted the keeper. From behind the chapel, where the oldest graves lay huddled together in broken ranks, the earth opened in a long dark split. Not like a grave opening, more like a wound. The ground sagged inward, and from that seam rose a form that at first seemed no more than a shadow and mist. Then the lantern light strengthened. The thing took on shape. It was tall, too tall by half, and bent at joints no human frame possessed. Grave cloth and root and strips of blackened wood clung to it. Its head was hooded, not by fabric, but by darkness gathered thickly about where a face should have been.
Keeper,
it said again. The word passed through the cemetery like cold water through ash. Father O'Connell could not move. Thomas Duncan stood very still, the lantern held in both hands now as if it had suddenly become very heavy. "I have kept them bound," he said. At once the shadow things and the risen dead nearest him stirred with sharpened interest, as hounds might stir at the first scent of blood. "Who are you?" Father O'Connell shouted before terror could stop him. At that, many heads turned toward him. The tall thing near the split earth answered,
I am what remained.
Thomas Duncan spoke without taking his eyes off it. "It has many names, none worth knowing. It feeds on unrest, on forgotten burials, on graves opened badly, on prayers unfinished, and all the dead who cannot lie still because no one taught them how." "And the lantern binds it?"
No.
That word chilled the priest. The being continued.
One soul to keep many quiet. One keeper to bear witness. One bearer of light so dark may have a shape. Such was the bargain.
Father O'Connell understood then, dimly and with mounting horror, that the lantern was not merely a tool. It was part of an agreement, ancient and cruelly practical. "And when the keeper dies?" he asked. "Then another takes the light." Thomas Duncan shut his eyes briefly. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter than before. "I died 12 years ago." Father O'Connell stared at him. The keeper went on as though confession were simply another task overdue. "A fever in winter. I remember the cot. I remember the cold in my chest. I remember thinking I had not the strength to climb the hill one more night." He looked at the lantern. "But I woke with this in my hand and the ground calling me by name." The priest's mouth had gone dry. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Duncan gave him a broken, almost incredulous look. "Who would believe me?" It was a fair question. "Why me?" Father O'Connell whispered. The ancient thing answered.
Because you came when warned away. Because you looked and did not go blind. Because the hill has already begun to know your steps.
The dead around them shifted closer. Father O'Connell backed toward the chapel wall. Thomas Duncan moved in front of him. "No!" The keeper's voice, though tired, held surprising force. "I have borne it this long. I'll bear it still."
You misunderstand your worth, Thomas Duncan. You were never chosen for devotion, only for availability.
The words struck the keeper, but he did not yield. With a sharp motion, he thrust the lantern high. Light burst across the cemetery in a wide, hard ring. Several of the risen dead recoiled instantly. The shadow beside Father O'Connell shrank backward with a hiss that was almost laughter. Even the ancient thing by the split earth seemed to dim at the edges. "Run!" Duncan shouted. For one wild second, the priest nearly obeyed. Every instinct of flesh urged him down the hill, away from the graves, away from the unholy light and the thing that had remained when too much death had soaked into one place. But he did not run. Whether from courage, duty, or mere paralysis, he could not later say. Instead, he seized the iron cross from beside the chapel door and stepped to Duncan's side. "I will not leave you here." The keeper almost smiled. "That," he said, "is exactly why it wants you." The old being laughed, a low, grating sound like stone dragged over a coffin lid. Then all at once, the cemetery moved again. The dead advanced. No stumbling blindly now, but with purpose. The woman in the rotted gown followed, her feet not quite touching the ground. Behind her came the jawless man and a cluster of lesser shades, each only half made, each hungry for shape. Thomas Duncan swung the lantern. "Say the burial prayers," he barked. Father O'Connell did. At first his voice shook. Then, steadied by habit and necessity, it grew louder. The ancient words of committal filled the air, and several of the nearer dead flinched as though struck. The woman in the gown clutched at her ruined throat. "Again!" Duncan shouted. The priest repeated the prayers, louder still. The lantern's light pulsed strangely with each phrase, not because the words powered it, he thought, but because the bargain recognized them. Burial law, witness, command, return. They fought the graveyard in that dreadful fashion for what might have been minutes or hours. Time lost meaning on the hill. There was only the cold moon overhead, the smell of opened earth, the blinding lantern light, and the relentless need to turn each thing back before another rose. Twice Father O'Connell felt unseen hands seize at his coat. Once a face appeared within inches of his own, a face with no eyes, and breathed the word,
"Remember,"
before Duncan drove it back with the lantern. Every time Duncan lifted it, every time he forced one more dead thing down, the keeper's body became less solid. The darkness inside him showed more clearly. The priest could see through the hand that gripped the lantern handle, through the coat sleeve, through the side of his face when the light struck at an angle. "Thomas," he said, "stop, you're—" "Already gone," Duncan answered. "Get them down first." "No!" The keeper rounded on him, sudden ferocity in what remained in his features. "If the Count is not satisfied before moonset, they will go into Hollowbrook." The priest looked down the hill. "Tell me what to do," Father O'Connell said. The keeper stared at him a moment, then nodded. "If I fall, take the lantern. Do not let it touch bare earth. Do not let the old one speak to you twice. And whatever face it shows you, do not answer to your own name." A fresh wave of dead had begun rising near the lower path. Together they drove them back, again and again. At last the eastern edge of the sky began, almost imperceptibly to pale. The moon had not yet set, but dawn was thinking about the valley.
It ends.
The split in the earth behind the chapel had closed. The graves that had opened were settling. The dead were gone. Only one figure remained standing. Father O'Connell. In his hand was the lantern. Thomas Duncan had vanished. Not fallen. Not turned to ash. Gone. As though the hill had at last taken back what it had borrowed. The priest stood alone among the graves, shaking, the lantern unbearably heavy in his hand. Its flame had become small again, almost ordinary, but not entirely. From somewhere very nearby, so near it might have been beside his ear, came a whisper. He closed his eyes and did not answer. The weeks that followed changed Hollowbrook only in ways the living could not properly name. Thomas Duncan was not seen again. Some assumed he had wandered off or died in his cottage. A search was made, briefly and without much conviction. No body was found. Yet from that week onward, a curious thing began to be noticed. Every night after sunset, a lantern moved slowly among the graves on the hill. The light wandered in patient circuits between the leaning stones. Sometimes it paused before certain graves. Sometimes it disappeared behind the chapel and reappeared on the far side of the yard. It did not go out until morning. Some who glimpsed it from the town crossed themselves. Some drew the curtains and looked away. And if anyone remarked that it seemed an odd duty for a parish priest to walk on a cemetery so late, others only muttered that Father O'Connell had become a serious sort of man since the full moon. On most nights, the work was bearable. He walked the graves with the lantern in hand and felt where unrest gathered. Some spirits rose only as mist-thin shapes with confused faces, uncertain of their own deaths. To those he spoke gently. Some needed the comfort of prayer, some only the command to lie still. A few followed him for a time like lonely animals and faded when ignored. But on certain nights, on the nights when the moon grew heavy and old weather gathered over Hollowbrook, the hill remembered itself. Then the whispers beneath the ground thickened. Then the lantern burned greener. The faces appeared in the dark beyond the graves, watching for the keeper with a patience that had outlived all ordinary malice. And on full moon nights, Father O'Connell stood where Thomas Duncan had stood and did what Thomas Duncan had done. He counted. He commanded. He held the dead above Hollowbrook. And when the wind is right, and the bell of St. Peter's has long since fallen silent for the night, the people of Hollowbrook draw their curtains, keep to their beds, and whisper the same words their fathers whispered before them. Poor Father O'Connell. The graveyard has taken him now.